Hey, how y'all doing? Before we get started with this video, I wanted to just take a minute and thank everybody that watches and who's come along from the beginning with this channel. And I'd also like to welcome a lot of new people that have kind of come on board in the last 6 months or so, 3 months, 2 weeks, whatever. I think a lot of people have come on since Thanksgiving. And I wanted to let you know that a little bit about the channel, if you're willing to listen. If you aren't, just scroll forward and go to the stories, that's fine. All we do is tell stories. That's all we do. We're not here to rock the Bigfoot world, to break down any Bigfoot pillars or anything like that. We're not trying to make a mark. We're not trying to ruffle anybody's feather, and we're not here to cause controversy. We're just here to have fun. That's the only reason I do this channel, is because it's fun. And I love stories, and I especially love these mysterious Bigfoot, UFO, dogman type stories. They're just, I don't know, there's something about them that just intrigues me. And so I'm not a Bigfoot hunter. I don't do all the research and stuff like that. We don't show photos. We don't do evidence. We don't try to prove anything or disprove anything. We're just here to have fun. So if you like cryptid stories, mysterious stories, stories of the unexplained, things like that, you're in the right place and you found your people. And I wanted you to know that. And I wanted to welcome you to the channel and tell you thank you for coming aboard and watching or listening to what I'm doing. And I really hope you enjoyed it. And we've got tons of stories to do, and I don't see an end to this for a long time. And we're just going to keep rocking and rolling with it. So I'm going to shut up now, welcome you to the channel, and we're going to roll into some Bigfoot stories. All right, here we go. Here's a letter I got recently that I think you guys will find interesting, so I'm just going to jump right into it. The writer doesn't want his name released, and that's no problem at all, and here's what he says. You know, it's a shame that we have to be so discreet about this topic, whatever it is that these beings are. The powers that be really don't want people to know about them, it seems. My father was born in 1928 under a bridge in Manitoba, Canada, the son of German immigrants who fled the rising Nazi popularity. They had a harsh life here, having nothing, and my dad worked from 6 years old on. This brought him to the far corners of our most beautiful continent. Even today, there are millions of square miles of Canada that have not been populated or even explored. My father was a very disciplined and no-nonsense man, yet when this topic came up when I was young, my dad simply said, "Son, there are things that we don't talk about." He didn't say that the big guy was nonsense or silly, he just said we don't talk about these things. My mom was more approachable when my dad wasn't around, and she simply said that these creatures exist just as bears and moose do, and it's that simple. If you leave them be, they will leave us be. They spent many years in remote isolation, and I've had the chance to spend 5 years of my life in remote reaches across Canada as well. I spent one stint of 7.5 months all alone. I can't tell you how many times I heard wood on wood smack around me, and I'm talking loud, hit you in the chest kind of loud. These were no woodpeckers, and no other large animal can grab a massive tree and smack it into another. I got so used to it that it actually eventually made me feel at home. It was almost nice to know that I was not alone. My wife wonders why I'm so focused on these creatures, and yes, she believes me, and I've explained that once you've experienced these things, it changes you. Not in a bad way, it just opens up your eyes to see that this world is more than the media and the government prop it up to be. And it's pretty neat. This is one of the events I experienced in Chetwynd in 1993. I worked for a lumber and holdings company based out of Prince George for the summers of 1993 through 1995. We were working helicon tracks being flown in daily for patching clear cuts that had failed their full effort replant several years before, or small sections that were too dry or too wet for the seedlings to take. The first few days were without issue. A few guys working the limit of the clear cut claimed to have seen some tracks in the mud. Huge tracks, larger than my size 14, and of course the rumors started to be passed around. Some responding surprisingly with, well, yeah, why wouldn't they be here? Generally, it's those who are local to British Columbia that didn't see it as a big deal. The guys who came from the East and Canada tended to be more skeptical and mocked the rest of us. But then a few days later, we started noticing our tree planting shovels disappearing. This went on day after day, and our boss was furious. Replacing lost shovels for workers when everything, including us, is flown in by helicopter to inaccessible areas is a big frickin' deal. It's not like we can just replace these quickly. Our boss basically said that whoever is doing this better stop this crap now, as you are not only going to lose your job, but I'm going to turn my back and let the guys who are now unable to work and make money have their way with you. We were all terrified of being labeled as a thief. Simultaneously, we all suspected the men that we liked the least. But the shovels kept disappearing. Soon after, someone began vandalizing our trucks. The trucks were as important as the shovels. From the site, we disembarked the helicopters. There was a 90-minute drive in our 1-ton four-wheel drives through a maze of Forest Service roads. The trucks were important to us. After a few days, it became apparent that there was no way any one of us was doing this. I mean, we all needed our paycheck, and we were all genuinely scared and furious at having our livelihoods compromised. Yet still, our shovels kept vanishing. At the base, the trucks were having large stones thrown at them and some breaking out windows. These were stones we struggled to roll, let alone lift, and the damage done to our trucks was like these stones were launched from a cannon. It was that extensive of damage. One truck that was only a couple of months new was in fact written off. Did we see anything? No. Did we hear anything? No, at least not there. But I also know that no one flew their own personal helicopter in each day just to steal our $45 shovels, and each person on my crew stayed the whole season, so it did not appear that there were any dissidents among us. So no, I can't say it was Sasquatch, but then I don't know of too many other possibilities. I don't know any animal that I've encountered in my 46 years in Canada that would and could steal shovels or launch a 50-pound stone. Whatever kind of being did this had dexterity and acted with intelligence and stealth, all the while maintaining a constant presence that over 50 hands didn't detect. So do I have the answers here? Was it Sasquatch? I've not seen one of these things face to face. I have lived alone in the woods and at times with a few others off the grid for nearly 5 years of my life in British Columbia, northern Manitoba, and central Ontario, often hundreds of miles from the nearest towns. I can say that in addition to my Chetwynd experience, I've seen tracks, I've heard calls that I can't place, and viewed tree origami that just doesn't make sense given the generally accepted catalog of North American animals. My wife and I are headed back to British Columbia to travel and camp, and then head up to the Yukon and Alaska next year. I can't wait. My heart is in those woods. Given my occupation and work, I need to ask that my name not be shared. I wish it were otherwise, but I know you have a keen interest in these things, and I wanted to share this with you. Man, that's a great email, and that's evidence that it can't be anything else. It can't. You've lived up there all your life. You know exactly what is in those woods and what those animals do. And you're right. Nothing does that anywhere. 50-pound stones? Come on, man. An elk or a bear or whatever's normal to those northwestern woodlands up in the Canadian territories like that, they just don't throw rocks like that. It takes two hands and two arms and a big barrel chest to pick something like that up and chunk it. Anyway, I thought it was a great story, and I figured you guys would enjoy that. Thanks to the writer for sending it to me. I do appreciate it. Here's a story I got recently from Joe. The story is dated 1938. It's really good. It's really an interesting story. It's a story that goes back several years, and it was told to him by his mom. And here's what he says. I'm going to tell you what I strongly believe is a Bigfoot story. This story was told to me by my mother several years ago when I was a kid. When my mother told me this story, it was not told as a Bigfoot story. In fact, as we all know, the phrase or name Bigfoot was not coined until 1958 in Bluff Creek, California, after Gerald Crew had made casts of some Bigfoot tracks he found near some heavy equipment. The locals started referring to whoever made the tracks as Bigfoot. The term Sasquatch has been around for much longer. Anyway, the whole point of this story is that Mom never told it as a Bigfoot story. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was always fascinated by Bigfoot things on TV. I remember shows like In Search Of when they dedicated an episode to Bigfoot. There are others as I grew up, and most of them terrified me to think that something like that could exist. Even though I was well versed on Bigfoot, it never occurred to me when Mom told us this story that it was actually possibly about a Bigfoot. It wasn't until much later that I put two and two together. I was able to because of things that I learned from always watching and reading Bigfoot stuff and encounters. So with all that said, here is my mother's story. Mom was born in Marfa, Texas, which is in Presidio County, south of the Fort Davis Mountains. Mom was born poor and she grew up poor. They lived in an adobe house that my grandfather built with his two hands, and even casted his own adobe bricks to build the house. They had no running water in the house and no electricity until she was a teenager. My grandfather worked in a local butcher shop mostly, and also periodically made trips to the Fort Davis Mountains to chop and collect wood, haul it back home, and cut it for selling. Grandma was a housewife and she raised 5 children, with Mom being the youngest. Mom was born in 1928, and she told me that when this happened, she was probably 10 or 11 years old, which would date the story to have happened in 1938 or 39. We are Hispanic, as my grandparents were born in Mexico, but all their children were born in Texas. Mom told us that sometimes on Saturday nights they would have company over for dinner to do fun things like play checkers and other games. Grandma's side of the family were musically talented, and Mom said that their cousins would come over on those Saturday nights and bring their guitars and fiddles, and they would play and sing. Grandma didn't allow any drinking in her house, so this was all good, clean family fun. One Saturday night, the family members had come over and enjoyed supper and then played games and their instruments and had fun just like always. Mom said they would stay late until about midnight, and the cousins and friends would soon slowly start to leave. This one night, one of Grandma's cousins decided that he would leave first because he was tired. His name was Örjan, and I'm pretty sure I'm butchering that poor man's name, but that's as close as I can get. Anyway, Örjan said his goodbyes and buenos noches and left, walking back home. Mom had been lying in bed this entire time listening in to what was going on, mainly because it was loud with conversation. Mom said that a few minutes went by as the rest of the gang was cleaning up and some were getting ready to leave. All of a sudden, there was a loud banging at the front door. The banging was so loud that it scared everyone half to death. The men rushed to the front door and opened it to see who it was, and it was Örjan. Mom had gotten up frightened but wanted to see who was at the door. She said Örjan rushed in the house as soon as they opened it, and in her words, he was like a crazy man. Örjan then fainted, and the men carried him to a cot and splashed water on his face. They noticed that he had scratches on his arms and face. After a few minutes, he came to and was much more calm and was able to tell them what happened. Örjan lived north of my grandma's house across an arroyo about maybe a half a mile. There was a pedestrian bridge directly down the dirt road to the west, and Örjan decided to take the shortcut across the arroyo that night instead of walking extra to the bridge. He stated that he had reached the arroyo and walked the slope and was walking in the arroyo when all of a sudden he saw a very large man-shaped shadowy figure up ahead. At first he thought it was a person, but as he continued to walk towards the figure, he realized that this dark figure was very tall and had hair all over it. He told the family that he could partially see because there was some moonlight that night, but could not see the figure's face. He told them that it smelled horrible. He tried to sidestep it, but the large hairy figure sidestepped with him, not allowing him to pass. Örjan stated he then started walking backwards and then turned and ran full speed back up the arroyo and then came up the slope. He ran through some mesquite brush, which caused the scratches on his arms and face. He ran until he got back to Grandma's house where he collapsed. Well, needless to say, everyone was spooked, and being very superstitious people, their first thought was that he had seen the devil. I remember asking Mom if the men in the family had gone to look for this devil, and she told me that they did no such thing. As a matter of fact, the visiting family all stayed the night, refusing to leave for fear of running into that devil. Well, I always remember that story, and as I said earlier, I was always fascinated with Bigfoot stories and encounters. It wasn't until much later that it dawned on me that the devil that night was most likely a Bigfoot. The tall, giant-sized figure, the hairy body, and the horrible smell are all indicators of a Bigfoot, as other people have described the same thing. If you are not familiar with that area, it is definitely some rough country. The Fort Davis Mountains are beautiful, and I myself, along with my wife, enjoy driving there just for the mountains. There are canyons, pine trees, and an abundance of wildlife such as deer, javelina, rabbits, badgers, mountain lion, and other animals. This country can sustain large animals without a doubt and can sustain them as they migrate. There's a corridor that runs from those mountains to Marfa and also to the northwest. The Big Bend National Park sits to the south of Marfa in the Chisos Mountain Range. The Chinati Mountains are between Marfa and Big Bend. If you look at the BFRO site, you will find a report sighting in the Fort Davis Mountains in 1977. Well, that's my mom's Bigfoot story, and I really hope that you can read this on your channel. I'm a big fan. Please just use my first name when and if you read this. Good luck and adios to all. Well, Joe, thanks for the email. That's a great story. It's a story that obviously goes back almost 100 years, 80 years at least. There was no name for Bigfoot at that time, like you said, and there are several stories out there like this, which leads me to believe this thing has been around a long time. And he wrote it really well, and I appreciate you sending it, Joe. It was just awesome. Thanks. This next story is from Dell. This is a great story. I really enjoyed reading this. Hope you like it too. Here's what Dell says. The title of his story is Bigfoot in Our Remote Fishing Camp. Bigfoot does exist. I have seen them. However, I cannot disclose the location of our Bigfoot fishing camp because I told them we would not, and also that we would not be back. They do not want to be bothered. They do not need to be hunted for proof of their existence. Many people have seen them. They deserve to be left alone. This location is so remote, I don't think anyone will find them anyway. The following is a true story. Bigfoot did come into our fishing camp. However, to properly put this fishing trip into perspective, I should provide a little personal background. I'm now 76 years old. After we were born, my dad returned to our Northwest Illinois home from World War II after serving in Africa and Guam. My twin brother and I were 2 years old. My father and his patent tank friend started us hunting and fishing at 3 years old. We fished for a variety of freshwater fish and hunted a variety of game. My twin brother and I were drafted in 1966. He was with the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, and I was with the 82nd Airborne Division. I became adept at reading a map and compass per airborne training that I received. After serving, we returned to our Illinois homes, and in 1969 we expanded our fishing with friends into the Ely, Minnesota boundary waters and fished out of a 17.5-foot sternback canoe powered by a 2.5 horsepower Johnson motor. We fished all over the boundary waters, sometimes traveling over 11 portages before setting up our fishing base camp for the week. After years of fishing in this area, we went farther north and fished all across Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, in base fishing camps and remote camps as well. The map, compass, landmark, and contour training and experience I received when with the 82nd Airborne Division became invaluable and imperative because on several occasions, my dad and I had to map out our daily trip with a camp manager before leaving in the morning. When not fishing with my dad and brothers, I fished from Costa Rica and north with my twin brother as far north as the Arctic Circle. Early on in the boundary waters and later in Canada, our fishing group consisted of my father, 2 brothers, a brother-in-law, and sometimes friends. In the late 1970s, only my dad and younger brother were on this trip. During this time, I was able to obtain some very detailed topographical maps and found an interesting remote lake with doubtful access for a 16-foot fishing boat, but allowable for our motor-powered canoe. Our trip started just after dawn on the Ontario borderline. We were traveling with only basic essentials to keep the canoe as light as possible. Luckily, the water level was high that year. I was running the motor, map, and compass not through rivers and lakes, but mostly through narrows and shallow waterways until we finally reached our destination in the early morning. It was interesting enough to note from the time we left our vehicle until the time we reached our destination, we didn't hear or see anyone, nor did we see a float plane. Once entering the lake, we found an opening along the southern shoreline facing northwest, allowing enough of a breeze to blow away the mosquitoes, plus room enough for our 2 small tents. We tied up our canoe at the west end of our camp in a heavily vegetated 12-foot waterway just before it emptied into the confluence of the Narrows and the lake. This lake was as unique and picturesque as we had hoped it would be. I scouted around the perimeter of our camp but did not find any human signs and figured if anyone had been here, it had not been for a very long time, which suited us just fine. We thought we had the place all to ourselves. By this time we were hungry and loaded up the canoe and set out to catch a meal. The shoreline we were on was full of 12-inch small rocks, and offshore were many submerged boulders, which we found to be full of smallmouth bass. They were a blast to catch, and soon we had enough for our evening meal. We set up a wire screening fish cage in a small waterway, allowing us to keep a few fish alive just in case the weather turned bad and we were not able to put our canoe into heavier wave action. As we sat around camp after dinner, we realized we had not seen or heard any loons. In fact, when we first reached this camp, I thought there were birds chirping in the trees on our southern perimeter, but currently it was very quiet. The light wind was blowing that way, so maybe they did not like the smoke and they left. We put out the fire. I checked our perimeter one last time. We had a 2-man tent and 1 smaller tent, and my brother laughed and said he wanted the smaller tent in the middle of our camp. I must have been asleep for a few hours when suddenly both of my arms were pinned to my side and my mouth was covered with my dad's hand. He pinned me so I could not be able to respond defensively, but still allowing me to see the serious look on his face. His finger in front of his face was in a quiet signal sign. He pointed out and mouthed without speaking that we had an intruder in our camp. I was instantly alert and able to sense there was an intruder in the center of our camp, close to our extinguished campfire and my younger brother. Whatever it was, more than likely was aware that we knew it was there as well. No one moved or made a sound for a couple of minutes. We could not see through the tent, but we knew it was there. There was not a noise, there was not an odor, nothing. We did not have a standoff, but we did have a stalemate. Whatever it was had to be very tall with great girth. Our visitor was within 2 to 3 feet of our tent. It hesitated for a second and then very slowly exited our camp on an easterly direction. After it left, we got out to inspect our campsite. Nothing had been disturbed. My younger brother was sleeping and said in the morning that he didn't know that we had had a visitor. We stayed awake for a while until heavy rainfall started and we all fell back asleep. We were up at 5:30 a.m. and looked around the campsite again, but nothing was out of order. I got a breakfast fire going and then more intently looked for tracks within our perimeter, but I could only find what appeared to be muffled surface which could not be identified as a possible rounded heel mark. The ground was firm, but we should have been able to detect a human boot mark or any animal with claws or hooves. I started tracking to the east in the direction of our visitor and did find some wet leaves slightly disturbed, so I moved further east until the leaves changed to pine needles. I could see slight impressions in the pine needles, but none of the adjacent vegetation seemed to be disturbed. I continued to follow for about 100 yards, and then all of a sudden, my instinct absolutely stopped me in place. I knew something was watching me. In fact, it seemed there may have been more than one in multiple locations. There were many huge diameter trees to the east and south, but the surrounding vegetation was not dense. 200 yards south, I saw a series of 3 long ridges, several hundred yards in length, and back-to-back on higher ground running from east to west. I really was not alarmed, but baffled because I have pretty good surveillance skills and I was intently applying them in order to know the identity of our visitors. Still, I could not see anything, but I knew they were there, so I called out to them. I said, "Good morning. I know you were in our fishing campsite last night. I do not know who you are, but we are only fishermen. There are 3 of us, my dad, my younger brother, and myself, and we wish you no harm. We realize we're in your territory. We do not wish to inconvenience or bother you. If you wish us to leave, let us know." I got no answer, so I said, "Okay, we will just stay. Just so you know, we are only here to fish for a week. We will be leaving at dawn next Friday morning. We will not be back." And then I returned to the camp. At 6:30 a.m., we were sitting around on logs eating bacon and eggs when we started hearing from our southeast a series of long calls from several hundred yards away. At first, we thought we may be close to a native Indian village, but our maps did not indicate any type of camp within 100 miles. The long calls continued for 20 minutes, and we progressively realized they were not human calls. They were not angry calls, but they seemed to be coming from our southeast and being answered in turn from our east, south, southwest, and west. The only way to describe these calls is to relate to the Bigfoot long calls recorded from Ohio and Kentucky. We shrugged it off as in drums from the jungle and added humor by stating, "Well, I guess they know we're here." When the serenade ended, we scouted along our shorelines and even moved out into the center of the lake in order to observe the shoreline in all directions. There was not any type of movement anywhere. The wind was light, the weather was excellent, no noise and no odors. The only exception was that there was no wildlife to be seen or heard. No birds, no eagles, and no loons. We have never been up north fishing without seeing or hearing the sounds of birds of some type. The good news, though, was that there were no bears either. We knew we were still being observed, but as far as we knew, there had not been any more visitors in our camp in daylight or during the night. Without issues for the rest of the week, we fished and had a great time catching and releasing, except for meals of smallmouth walleye and northern pike. At least that was the case until Thursday evening. Dad said he was going to stay in base camp this evening to rest up because it was going to be a long trip out tomorrow morning, and said that we should fish anyway. And he added, but make sure to be back before dark in order to avoid the undetected deadhead logs or reefs on the way back. My brother and I fished our shoreline for smallmouth bass on this evening, as our limit allowed 6 each in those days. The evening weather and fishing conditions were perfect for drift fishing with a canoe. We moved a few more miles east than before to start our drift fishing. We caught our supper except for a couple of bass short of our limit, but we still had a half hour of daylight left. We found an opening in the southern shoreline that could not readily be seen when out on the lake. Fishing had slowed quite a bit on the lake shoreline, so we drifted into the narrow opening and found it quickly open to about 40 feet in width. We thought this was a real find, as we could see that it was about 100 yards in length, and then it opened into a lily pad bay to the east. It then wrapped around 90 degrees to the right and continued undetected to the west. We drifted about 40 yards towards the inviting lily pad bay while casting both shorelines for bass. All of a sudden, to our west was a sudden, unexpected, extreme, and unbelievably loud wham. The only way I can describe it is someone with tremendous strength and flexibility swinging a 6-inch diameter solid wooden fence post against a nearby hardwood tree trunk. My brother later stated he thought someone had swung a log against a very large tree trunk. I have never before and never since heard a noise quite like that. However, I have never forgotten to this day the sound it made. Immediately, we both looked to the west, and in our amazement, there were 2 Bigfoot no more than 70 yards away. We could only see 2 of them, but there was no question to what they were. They were Bigfoot or Sasquatch, if you prefer, and they were looking right at us. Both were solid black in color. They were both very large in height, very wide shoulder width, and solidly built like greatly oversized linebackers. We were both extremely surprised, with a better word being astonished, but even so, I instinctively knew that their wham action required a response, so I immediately raised my hand as high as possible with the palm of my hand wide open while facing them. Neither one of them was trying to hide. It was obvious they wanted us to see them. Even today, I do not have to close my eyes to remember their physical details. Specifically, I remember their heads virtually sat right on top of their shoulders. I'm pretty sure they were both males. We could only see the one on the right from the waist up, but we estimated his height at about 8 feet. The second one on the left, about 10 feet south of the first one, standing upright next to a tree. He was not hiding behind the tree and 90% in the open. He was much wider than the diameter of the very large hardwood tree, so he could not have hidden behind the tree even if he had wanted to. He was also solid black from head to toe. Even their eyes appeared to be black. We estimated his height was around 7.5 feet, maybe a touch larger. They both were solidly built and muscularly tapered, offering an extremely athletic appearance. It appeared that they were not happy to see us, as they had serious facial expressions. We knew we had been watched during the entire week, so they knew we entered their channel and base camp area by accident. I was able to observe as much of their perimeter in a very short time. It was easy to see they had a virtually undetected paradise along their wraparound waterway at the end in between the 3 ridge lines. Neither of them made a move or made any noise at all. They didn't seem mad at us. They did not seem to be impatient. They just stood there looking at us. It seemed like they knew we were astonished to see them and were giving us the benefit of the doubt while waiting to see what we were going to do. I looked over to my younger brother, who had the look on his face like the fishing in this waterway is over, and I said to him, "I think it's time that we need to leave." And he answered, "I agree." I cranked up the motor, I made a U-turn, and we exited into the main lake. We had knowledge of any hazards along our southern shoreline. Nighttime arrived quickly, and even though it was virtually pitch black, the moonlight allowed a 20-minute full-speed run all the way back to our campsite. Dad heard us coming and said as we tied up the canoe, "I thought I told you boys to be back before dark." And then, like always, he asked, "Did you catch anything?" We laughed and said, "Yes, we have to clean them." I asked him if all had been quiet, and he replied there had been sounds in the brush south of camp, but nothing that was disturbing. All three of us enjoyed a great last fish dinner that night while filling him in on our encounter with our newly identified and acquired Bigfoot friends. Ironically, he smiled and stated, "I thought so." Bigfoot did not come into our camp during our last night, but we knew that they were around. Maybe they enjoyed our company and our expressions when whamming that tree trunk. We don't know. We had not expected to meet and identify them up close and personal as we had, but we appreciated the consideration they gave us when fishing in their territory. Maybe they appreciated on their part that we stayed close to our camp perimeter except when fishing. Maybe they protected us in our campsite from bears when we were out fishing. Our trip turned out to be a more of an unexpected pleasure than we could have hoped for, but as we told them, we would not be back. We packed up the canoe as much as we could the night before and the rest that morning. We broke camp and just after doing so made one last perimeter tour. I could not see the Bigfoot family, but I knew they were watching. I raised my hand high in the air in their direction and I yelled out, "Thank you. We will not be back." Then before leaving, we hung a fish stringer and the wire fish cage on a tree limb on the visitor side of our campsite, and then we joined Dad and my brother in the canoe. It took us from about 6:30 a.m. to dusk again running map and compass to get back to our vehicle. Again, as on the way in, we did not see or hear anyone during the time from breaking campsite until after getting back to our vehicle and down the road for miles before, even seeing headlights from another vehicle. We finally found a family-owned restaurant still open that catered to late-day and remote-type fishermen like us needing showers and greatly appreciated a good steak dinner. Ironically, at dinner, Dad threw out for discussion, but stated he thought he was getting a little too old to continue sleeping on the ground in remote fishing camps. He recommended that we try a cabin on a lake in the future, which for the most part we did until he passed away many years later. In the meantime, we had many great fishing trips, but this one with Bigfoot was especially unique. So that is our story, Mr. Dixiecryptid. I realize it's a little long, but I felt it had to be detailed to provide the reality of the week-long experience. I hope you and your listeners all enjoyed it as much as we did. Signed, Dell. Dell, that's a great story. I love the way you wrote it. Man, I'm so jealous that you got to fish all those places all your life. And then on one of those fishing trips, you got to have an encounter with Bigfoot. I think that's exciting. Thank you, sir, for spending the time to share with us some of your memories. Well, I know everyone enjoyed it. Okay, that's going to wind up a long video. I hope you guys were able to sit through all that and enjoy it, or at least leave it and come back to it and listen to the whole thing, because I think all three of these stories are really worth hearing. So I appreciate you watching this far as usual, and I guess we'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks a lot.